we often see the age of a nation or civilization as a point of pride. That's why some go to great lengths to make their history seem even older. As a result, relatively young cities might latch onto any ancient settlement found nearby as their official starting point. But if we look at the world's first civilizations, they all emerged in warm climates, near major rivers, in regions where early agriculture was most effective. In many ways, the biggest advantage of the ancient Egyptians, Sumerians, and the people of the Indus and Yellow River valleys was simply being in the right place at the right time. Tribes in the Arctic or dense jungles weren't any less intelligent, but their environment kept them stuck in the Stone Age. Those same environmental factors led to food shortages, or on the flip side, periods of abundance that triggered mass migrations and invasions. Most of these came from the vast Eurasian steppe, stretching from eastern Mongolia to Hungary. By the 21st century, only a handful of countries can still trace a direct line back to those ancient civilizations. One of them is China. And despite its long history, even China sometimes tries to make its past seem even older, which ironically undermines its credibility. The first civilizations appeared around the 4th millennium BCE. China wasn't the first. It reached literacy and urbanization later than the Sumerians, Egyptians, or Indians, but it advanced quickly, especially in metallurgy. Since ancient times, the primary weapon for hunting and warfare was the spear. Alongside it, a knife or dagger was a useful backup. With the advent of bronze, daggers got longer, first becoming short swords, and by the 2nd millennium BCE, full-length swords. This process happened across vast regions, meaning the sword likely has no single homeland. It was simply the natural evolution of the dagger. By the Shang dynasty, a little over 3,000 years ago, China was already producing bronze swords around 80 centimeters long. The classic straight double-edged sword became known as the Jian. The golden age of long-bladed weapons came in the 1st millennium BCE, likely tied to the shift from chariot warfare to infantry and cavalry combat. If you look at these blades, they resemble much later European medieval swords. And don't be surprised by the unusual handles. These swords had soft wrappings, so the protruding parts weren't an issue. One fascinating example of early Chinese swords is the Jian sword, which is 2,500 years old. It's relatively compact, just 55 centimeters long, though by that time Chinese smiths were already making blades up to a meter in length. What's especially interesting is that its blade is made of bronze with a high tin content. While Greek bronze weapons tended to bend, the Chinese increased tin levels and added chromium and other elements to create harder, sharper blades. However, these swords didn't flex under pressure, they broke. Even though blacksmiths had learned to work with iron as early as the 8th century BCE, bronze weapons remained in use alongside them all the way up to the 3rd century BCE. If we compare modern bronze and steel, steel is about 35–40% harder, but surprisingly, bronze often has a higher tensile strength. Another key difference is in metalworking techniques. A bloomery furnace could fully melt bronze, allowing for casting, but when working with iron ore, it never fully liquefied. What came out was a solid mass of iron and slag that had to be painstakingly refined. The Chinese, however, loved to experiment. As early as the 1st millennium BCE, they started mixing refined iron with charcoal and heating it in special furnaces for days at a time. This process required enormous amounts of fuel, but it eliminated slag and produced cast iron, which could then be forged into steel. Europe wouldn't develop cast iron production until the 14th century, and in Muscovy it first appeared in the 16th century. Yet archaeological finds suggest that, for example, the Mongols were already using cast iron cauldrons in the 13th century. One reason China survived so many nomadic invasions was that conquerors, upon settling, became fascinated by the luxuries of civilization. They founded ruling dynasties, gradually integrated, and were eventually absorbed into Chinese society. History, however, has a sense of irony. Despite its innovations and ancient roots, China wasn't the place where the world's next great transformation happened. That role fell to the barbarians, the Europeans, who eventually turned China into a dependent territory, leading to one of the greatest declines in Chinese history. But back to Chinese Jian swords, there's an interesting trend. The early Jian were robust, with wide blades often reinforced with a central ridge. But by the turn of the millennium, they had become thinner. In the medieval era, most Jian looked downright fragile. Despite being around a meter long, their blades were just 3 centimeters wide and weighed between 700 and 900 grams. These weren't the kinds of weapons you'd confidently swing at an armored opponent. The reason? It all comes down to China's social structure and another type of blade. In early civilizations, priests and bureaucrats often held high status, while in regions that adopted civilization from the outside, military elites played the dominant role. Take feudal Europe, for example. Essentially, former barbarians built their civilization on the foundations of the ancient world, with warriors at its core. Or Japan, which started by copying China's government system but ended up with a shogunate, looking more like medieval Europe. Meanwhile, China was ruled not by warriors but by bureaucrats. For much of its history and theory, any peasant could rise to a high-ranking government position if they passed the exams and proved their abilities. Of course, that often meant their entire village had to pitch in to pay for their education. Still, though limited, social mobility existed, offering a small but real chance for a bright commoner to rise to power. These exams, known as keiju, were the key to climbing the social ladder. However, merchants were often barred from taking them since they were considered unfit for government affairs. Over time, the Chinese sword also changed. Expensive to make and a status symbol, it gradually became an accessory for officials and elites rather than a battlefield weapon. The same thing happened in late medieval and early modern Europe, where knights moved to cities, became nobles, and took on administrative roles. Their heavy swords evolved into slimmer, more refined rapiers. In China, the Jian became a sort of rapier even before longswords became popular on European battlefields. And during the period known in the West as the early Middle Ages, the Jian was gradually replaced in warfare by another bladed weapon, the dao. The dao was single-edged, often slightly curved. Some looked like sabers, others like broadswords, but most closely resembled the European falchion. It was simpler, cheaper, and easier to use than the Jian, delivering more powerful slashing strikes. In short, affordable, effective, and practical. That's why it became the primary combat blade. Meanwhile, the Jian became more of a self-defense weapon, a status symbol, and even part of rituals. By at least the 3rd century BCE, the Chinese had developed advanced sword-fighting techniques. Ancient texts mention feints and deceptive movements. Later, a fencing school called the walking sword emerged, teaching that blades shouldn't clash, and parrying relied on agility and dodging. The strikes in this style were short, quick thrusts, and slicing motions. This eventually led to modern Chinese martial arts practices that are more acrobatic than combative. Perhaps that's why the Jian, unlike the European rapier, never developed a complex handguard, since the fighting style didn't require one, and duels among Chinese officials were probably rare. These weren't warriors struggling to adapt to urban life. For most of its history, the Jian wasn't a battlefield weapon. It was something between a self-defense tool, a status symbol, and a way to show off one's skill. It was the opposite of the simpler, rougher, but more practical dao. Despite this, around 99,000 Jian swords have survived to this day, twice as many as dao. For comparison, only about 200 medieval swords have been found in Russia, and even in Viking-famous Norway, only about 2,000. Chinese history is a vast, unfamiliar world, both to Europeans in general and to me personally. And its massive arsenal holds plenty of fascinating weapons, though unfortunately reliable information on them isn't always easy to find.